Good morning or good evening, wherever you're listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCYB TV Productions, where we like to dig a lot deeper than the mainstream media. And of course, judging from the media nowadays, that's not too difficult. So, anyway, before I begin, and I promise you this will be a very interesting and informative segment. Before I begin, I'd like to encourage people, if you're listening to this later on YouTube, to please subscribe to this station. Also, if you really like science fiction, then check out my new book, The Destiny of Our Past. And you can find that on Amazon. Anyway, now, what I would like to actually do is deal somewhat theoretically, but I'd like to ask basically how the psychological pioneer Sigmund Freud would have judged today's society. Now, before I go on here, I want to caution people. There is this idea that if someone talks a lot about issues like human sexuality and so forth, then there's almost an assumption that they must be fairly liberal or left-leaning. And I don't think that would be the case. I seriously don't. In fact, if Freud were alive today, I think he would be considered a radical conservative. Now, I would note that it's quite interesting that I have talked to people more to the left, and if you bring up Sigmund Freud to them, the first thing that comes to their mind, or what they say at least, is, oh, he's been discredited long ago. And then when you ask the question, oh, really? What was discredited? Can you be more specific? And then you get silence. There's this look, because ultimately a lot, and this started from my understanding in the 1980s, there was a lot of people on the left who felt that they didn't want to deal with Freud anymore. Because I think, to a large degree, Freud dealt in absolutes. Also, he was very deterministic. And, of course, if, for instance, his belief was that the ultimate maturity of a human being was to grow through the various psychosexual stages, to get married and to have children, that tends not to be something that is popular amongst people on the left. I'm not saying that everyone on the left, throws marriage away or that sort of thing. I'm just saying that the academics, the people at the forefront of this movement to change people's views on society and marriage and family and stuff like that, they tended to want to throw Freud under the bus, get rid of Freud, and so forth. In fact, I even heard some leftists say the same thing about the working class, that during this time period there was this move to kind of distance the left from the working class, which is somewhat ironic, actually. But ultimately, here's what I just want to start out here by just explain a little tiny bit about his views on humans, and then I'm going to go into how I think that would contradict today's society. So, give Freud a chance here. Anyway, Freud believed, first of all, that the human psyche was divided into three main components. Now, these are metaphorical. There's not like a chunk of the brain that does this or a chunk that does that. Okay, now there may be some corresponding things like, your instincts and drives might be more centered in the hypothalamus, but the human brain is quite complex, actually. So therefore, if you're talking about human sexuality, you can't discount the cerebral cortex, the thinking part, and so forth of human beings. The human brain is not really well understood. Oh, sure, when you go to high school, there's this sense of, oh, they've got it down. Here's where this is, here's where this is, here's where this is, here's where this is. Then you go to college, and if you pursue psychology, then you find out, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And then I guess, at least I've heard many, PhDs in psychology, teaching psychology courses saying that, well, once you get to about the PhD level, you're kind of like, we really don't know very much. Okay? So, Freud, again, it's metaphorical. The id would be the instincts and drives. The things that we share with other mammals. The desire to reproduce. Sex. Hunger. The desire to eat. Drink. The desire to get shelter. Aggression. And so forth. These drives that basically, if you took them out of humans, human beings would perish. Often people be like, oh, I just really am down on humanity. We're such a violent species. Actually, we are, but at the same time, take a look at all the other species. Okay? I don't think you'll find a species of mammal, and certainly not reptiles, that are, this utopian, peaceful kind of creature. So, if we weren't, for instance, you think, okay, well, hate and jealousy are bad things. Take them away. What would you have? Would you really want your husband or wife to, whenever they felt like having a fling, to go ahead and do it? Of course, jealousy can lead to really bad things, but at the same time, it also kind of pulls us together. Otherwise, if you wouldn't be jealous, that means you kind of don't care. So, but anyway, the id is the instincts. The ego is kind of like your conscious self. The self that you perceive, or as Carl Jung would say, the persona that is, I don't want to get too complicated. Let's just say, the idea of the persona, without getting too complicated here with Jung. But it's kind of the part of you that you're thinking of as yourself right now. It's your self-image. It's also your interaction with the world that people see and so forth. Your personality is what many people would refer to it as, even though, again, it gets way more complicated. Then there's the superego. The superego is the morals that you've been taught. The idea that if you don't follow those morals, that you will kind of turn on yourself and feel guilt and shame and so forth. Most of these are all buried in your subconscious. Okay? Both your instinctive drives as well as what you've been taught is right and wrong, and they work often in opposition to each other, but sometimes in coordination with each other to make you who you are. So that's a very simple, quick explanation for that. And then he goes through also the psychosexual components to stages that you go through when growing up. Some people take it very literally, and therefore they think he's kind of weird. But he was talking, he made the labels, for instance, the oral stage, where everything seems to revolve around the mouth. A child likes to suck on things and to bite things and stuff like that. And so during that stage, he said these sorts of things take place, which I'll go into in much more detail here in a moment. But ultimately, what it means is you don't remember much from when you were like, up to 2 years of age. You just don't remember much. But Freud believed that your brain remembered emotions. Okay? Maybe not specific experiences, but the emotional connection to those experiences. So therefore, if your mother was very distant, she ignored you when you cried and that sort of thing, you might wind up being a very distrustful person. And you have a harder time committing later as you grow up, and you may wonder why you have such a hard time committing. But Freud would say it's buried in the way that you were raised. And it's not necessarily something that you can totally control. You can deal with it if you understand it. But ultimately, this is where the determinism comes in. It was forced into you, much like a puppy. When you're training a puppy, the puppy learns this happens when this happens. And sometimes, when a dog does something wrong, like what's on the floor, it gets that kind of sad, guilty look about it, kind of almost a scared look. And, this would be the same in humans. Much more complex, but ultimately it's the same basic process. The puppy's not sitting there remembering every single time you were not happy with it when it gets older, and it does something wrong. But it will be a feeling, something that it just feels when it has made you unhappy with its behavior. And then you have the anal stage. Sounds kind of weird, but that's kind of like when you're learning that you can control your environment. And so forth. The idea that you can, you learn when, this is when you have to conform to society, because before you just, ate, went to the bathroom, and that's pretty much it. But now you're getting to a stage where this is where this superego kind of starts to develop. And it's this stage where you learn that you need to conform. You can't just go. Mom is sitting there saying, use this instrument, the toilet, to go to the bathroom. And again, Freud's, just uses that term. He uses that term just to describe the basic ideas of when things take place and what's going on there. Now, oh gosh, something stuck in my throat here. Just a second. Oh, yeah, that's better. Now, then the next stage, of course, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but because it's really complicated, but the phallic stage is when Freud felt that you start developing, you start kind of distancing yourself more from your mom, and you start forming an attachment to the opposite sex parent. They become an ideal. You get this idea that, this is where that song, I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old dad. This is actually a Freudian concept. And they even find, today that if you look at married couples, that people seem to gravitate to people that look a lot more like them than chance would dictate. So therefore, at least from the Freudian perspective, when you look out at a mall and you see married couples and you're going, wow, they almost look like brothers and sisters. Well, according to Freud, this is not because they have a secret desire for incest, so they marry someone that reminds them of their brother or sister. Instead, they're gravitating towards their opposite sex parent, which means that they are, that would explain why you have similarities in looks with married couples, even interracial couples, you'll often notice that the similarities are quite striking. So, this is Freud's explanation for it. Then you have the latency stage, where in his theory, these psychosexual drives that were kind of emerging prior to this are repressed. He felt that the young person shouldn't be concentrating on these kinds of energies. And this lasts till about, from 6 to 12. And the idea is you shouldn't be concentrating on things dealing with sex and so forth, because now you need to grow up. And not that, sex is not a grown-up thing. What you need to do is you need to start developing skills for survival so that someday you will meet someone and, be able to fall into, the idea that you're going to be able to, support them or support the family and so forth. So the latency stage, if you think about in primitive tribes in the jungle where, maybe young men, when they reach about 7 or 8, they are integrated into the village elders, and they learn how to hunt. They learn how to, get food, build shelter, and these kinds of things. And, we used to do that. I mean, if you look at in the old days, even in the colonial era, it's quite interesting that young boys, the age of 12 maybe, would serve on ships. They, fishing ships, whaling ships, pretty much they were working, and young girls at that age were learning how to take care of a home and to cook and to take care of babies, and usually families were large enough then that older sisters took care along with the mother of the children. So Freud felt this was a stage where, let's not get things all confused now. Let's just go ahead and focus on developing skills and learning and so forth. And then finally, around 13, generally, puberty, which is the genital stage of development, where, it may be awkward, but people learn the skills by which they can meet and develop relationships and grow as individuals that will be able to actually form a relationship and perpetuate the species as they bring in children who will go through the same stages. Okay, now, that was your really crash course in Freudian psychology. So, hopefully you'll be able to understand when I go back to these particular concepts here. Now, let's just think about what Freud would think today of, for instance, the idea of these psychosexual stages. Freud felt it was very crucial for a child to be nurtured when they were very young. Now again, I'm just, I'm not making any value judgments or anything. I'm just saying, how he would feel about what's going on in today's society. First of all, I think he would be very concerned with the idea that often we leave our, young children with daycare. I mean, I think he would actually feel this way because in daycare, you're not going to get that same nurturing. I mean, yes, many daycare workers are fantastic people, but they cannot provide the same nurturing as a parent can. And so I think he would think that we were going to start developing a strong sense of separation anxiety when you take a very young child, toddler or younger, and they're wondering what's going on when they get left in a strange place with strange smells, with strange other people that are not their siblings, and so forth. I mean, I think that he would say that this was creating a sense of not being able to feel comfortable and attached and safe. Now again, I'm not saying the daycare centers are not safe. I'm saying that he would feel that the instinctive drives of a young child will be the same way as if you take a very small, use a dog analogy. You take a very small puppy and pull it away from its mom, and it wants to be back with its mom. It's not going to just snuggle up with you like, oh, you're wonderful. It's going to want to be back. It might for a bit, but it wants to be back with its mother. Okay, and so this is something that maybe would be cause for concern to a degree. Up to the individual to examine and come to their own conclusions. The thing I would like to jump to the most here also is that Freud's ideas are that the family creates the norms for the child to grow up in. You remember when I said the thing about the ego and the superego and that sort of thing? The superego are rules and expectations. And so naturally humans came from small groups of people in which everyone had kind of a shared sense of this is the way things are, these are the rules, these are the expectations, this is the, how we feel about religion and those kinds of things. And I'm wondering how much we see that in today's society where we have all kinds of media that we plop young children in front of. And, they don't have that analysis that we do. And they're being exposed to, well, what is the norm? And when they see things happening on TV that are maybe violent or, whatever. And I mean this in the context of real human violence. Okay, there have been numerous studies that have shown that cartoon-ish violence, the old Tom and Jerry's and Bugs Bunny, that sort of thing, doesn't seem to have any kind of effect on children. It doesn't make them want to go up on a hill and drop an anvil down on their best friend or something like that. Okay, it doesn't. However, when you have realistic violence shown, people hitting someone, for instance, that's something that's actually real. That's something, oh no, it may be fake on TV. The child does not perceive it as real. Okay, many times children could watch, for instance, a Western on TV and wonder, why are these people when at a very young age, maybe 4 years old, and wonder, why are these people allowing themselves to get killed for a movie? I remember one of my children, I had the TV show on, and they were very young. 4 or 5 years old. And they were watching, yeah, I know, it was kind of weird, but they loved this show. I, Claudius, which was a production that was done on the Roman Emperor Claudius. And he kind of freaked out when the guy that played on Star Trek as the captain, he was much younger when he played in this, and his character gets killed in the show. And he thought this meant that this character was actually dead. And he'd never see him again on Star Trek. And I think children are we take for granted that they're actually quite innocent in the way they see life. I've heard of other children who believe that all their cartoon characters actually exist. They're somewhere, they don't know where, but somewhere you will find, like I said, Bugs Bunny and Foghorn Leghorn and all those all those characters, in a real place and really being alive. This, means that, if you do put kids in front of TV, that both can challenge their views on how the parents feel about how life is, or, violence and behavior that's just not part of how they're raised, this can create some problems in their minds. And I think maybe some of our confusion in today's society, at least according to what Freud would say, is based on this. Oh, I'll get to this in much more detail later, believe me. Phallic stage. I'd actually like to kind of skip over this a little bit here, but I'd like to go into the latency stage. Because I think that latency, when I've said that children around 11, 12 years of age, that's when it ends, but it starts around 6. How many children today between the ages of 6 and 12 have seen pornography on their iPhones, computers, and so forth? Now, I'm not going to turn this into one of those things because there's so much controversy in regards to pornography and different viewpoints, and some people it's like a hardcore, well, this is this way, and other people are like, well, if you've ever seen a Sports Illustrated, then you're a porn addict, and so forth. I'm not going to get into that as an issue. What I am going to say is that Freud would actually probably think, what is the effect on children who shouldn't be really thinking about these things, but should actually be engaged in learning and developing and so forth, and not, wind up with what he called a fixation. See, fixation is something that can happen when you haven't gone through one of these stages properly, or when something hits you during the stage that is not really appropriate for that particular stage. So Freud would be very concerned with a 10-year-old male or female looking at images of people having sex. And also that would be true too of, TV shows where maybe it's not, what's the difference? You just show a little bit more, strategy in the way you film the characters when they're on a regular, TV show and they're supposed to be engaged in sex. And these kinds of things. I mean, he felt that there was this major thing that would happen if a child opens a door and whoa, there's mom and dad. In theory, they're looking at this stuff all the time. If they're watching TV. And if they're looking at pornography, they're seeing it in much more explicit detail. Freud would be very concerned with that. In fact, Freud would even, I remember that I once ran across this article in a conservative journal that was dealing with how Freud would view sex education. And again, Freud would actually probably say this is not appropriate for children. And because they're not supposed to be thinking along those lines. And because this could cause confusion and fixation. So in this sense, I think Freud would be considered, he'd be like to the right of any of these TV evangelists that come on and deal with these issues, or certainly to the right of Donald Trump or your typical conservative congressman or senator. So again, he'd be conservative in how he felt the implications would be. Freud, by the way, at least, he was atheistic, so he wouldn't really fit in so well with the religious right. At the same time, again, his views would certainly not be welcomed on the more secular left. Now, when we're also dealing with the way society is you see these stories, and I think they're quite unfair because they paint a picture for the entire, millennial generation. But you often see these stories about young people, and I don't mean 12-year-olds. I'm talking about people in college who freak out when someone says something in class they disagree with and they want a safe space, or if their views are challenged, they don't argue, they start crying, and they even will petition for anything that might offend them to be banned. And in my opinion, in a democratic society, that's not a very mature way of being, because ultimately everyone gets offended with everything. If we ban everything that's offensive to everyone, then essentially we can't. we won't even have a society. You'd be afraid to say hello to someone, which seems to be happening nowadays with a lot of people. They're afraid that a man and woman, at work says hello, then certainly they're scared to say, oh, that's a really nice suit on you, or you've been getting in shape, it looks like, or, oh, that's a really nice dress, or whatever. They're afraid they're going to get called into the human resources because of sexual harassment. I will note that I think it could be England too. America and England seem to be the only countries that have really taken this to this extreme. Okay? That may say something about Anglo-Saxon ways of looking at issues. But ultimately, I believe that Freud would actually say that the children have not gone through enough training as young people and also hardship. We try to protect our children nowadays. Oh my gosh, Johnny failed his test. I need to go talk to the teacher. And then Johnny gets the idea that parents can jump in and they're the white knights that come in and save them when they foul up on a test. Is that going to teach them maturity when a professor later on fails them on a test? Professor doesn't care what the parents say, unless the parents are like multimillionaires who donate to the university. It's not going to make any difference. That Johnny, who's 23 years old, just failed on his test. Okay, it's not going to matter to the professor that Johnny's mommy calls him and asks why, this happened. The other thing is that Freud felt that we need to, in a society such as ours, a complex civilization, you need to sublimate drives. That means, for instance, if someone has a strong sex drive, they can't just be going around and, be grabbing at people and that sort of thing. They should sublimate those drives into things that will develop them and also make it possible for them to find a spouse someday. And I think Freud would look at, like, for instance, internet porn and things like this and feel like this would be a diversion. This would take people away from the idea of, I need to find a relationship with someone that I can express healthy sexuality within that relationship. And instead it turns into too busy for that or whatever. And they find pornography to be a substitute. I'm not one of those people that says that everyone that looks at porn is going to wind up, being a total failure. I'm not. I'm just saying that there is a significant number of young people, primarily but not exclusively males, who find that it's a great substitute just to kind of like, okay, well, I'm just going to deal with these kinds of desires through this instead of, I'm feeling kind of lonely and maybe I need to get a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. And, then, it grows and finally develops into, marriage. And of course, Freud's view on making babies. And also, if we think about this too, all of the energy and drive for advancement, how would he feel about people spending hours just watching TV or on the internet, on social media? I think he'd be very concerned, A, with the TV because it's the biggest time waster there is. Yes, it's okay to relax in front of TV once in a while and watch a program. But 5 hours, if you're sitting there flipping through the channels for 5 hours, there's something wrong there because you're wasting an incredible amount of time and energy that could be used to develop yourself physically, to develop yourself intellectually, and in all other areas of life. And then we get, social media, which is more popular among young people. But still, it is something that all ages use. And social media, we get this kind of narcissistic frenzy of, I've got to have the best picture. I've got to have this. I've got to have all these likes. What's interesting going on? Oh, look, here's a really interesting Vine, or here's a very interesting little meme. Here's this. And if you ever look at people looking through their media, their social media, they're flipping through really fast, looking for something that catches their eye. But that only gives them that little, woo, that's interesting, thrill for a few seconds, or even less. And then they're on to another one, and then another, and another, and another, and another. And so if you say, here's an interesting article to read, often they'll say, I don't have time for that. And it could be a short article. But yet they have the time to be flipping through social media. I hear a lot of educators say, oh my gosh, I can't keep the attention of my students. Now, of course, that was, I remember quite some time ago when people said, well, we got the MTV generation. It's kind of like they were watching music videos. It was more interesting. And so the teachers had to kind of become more interesting than the music videos in order to keep their attention, or else the kids just kind of drift away. But now you've got social media in which there's this addiction that was, I think, is way beyond what TV does. Because, you see, you can't carry a TV in your pocket in the traditional sense. But the social media, you can carry that in your pocket. And when you see people when schools, and this is actually something across the world, when schools will say, oh, you can't have your cell phone in classroom. And they're these kids are like shaking. Like, no, I got to hold on to this. I think Freud would say that's actually quite unhealthy and could actually create a arrested development situation where people are continuously wanting to be the popular teenager when they're 35 years old. Have you ever thought about that? The social media is ultimately aiming itself for those young people that spend lots of time and is trying to get on there and stuff. But when you have a 35-year-old that's on there, they're starting to get into that culture and they're trying to be the teenager that was the cool kid. And if they're not, they start feeling a little bit depressed. Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? Am I wearing the right clothes? Am I doing the right things? Am I interesting enough? Is my picture on my profile pretty enough or handsome enough or whatever? This is something that's very disconcerting. That actually is something Freud would have been thinking was going to really increase mental illness. Is it? I'm just saying that's what Freud would say. That you're going to get a lot more mental illness symptoms pop up in such an environment. And also that concept of sublimation, that putting things, these desires under and then using them like, water, you got a rushing river, you put a dam on it, and then you can use the water for irrigation and it prevents flooding and that sort of thing. Maybe we're becoming a little bit more geared towards, I want it now. I want it instantaneously. So Freud would be probably thinking, my gosh, where's things going? Oh, there's one last thing I have to deal with. I almost forgot. All these shows on that report, they bring a guest on and they're talking about psychology, how to raise your kids, how to proper relationships. And then you see all these magazines out there, how to do this, how to do that, how to do this. And they kind of have a little element of psychology in them. But ultimately, I think Freud would be just like I think Freud would actually believe that a little bit of psychology can be more dangerous than no psychology at all. Because you throw a little something in and then people start going, oh, this is the way it is. This psychology says this. And then they find something else. Oh no, this is what it says. And a lot of it's made into kind of a pop thing, pop psychology, without really understanding the way that it really was. And much of the way it's taught in American high schools is pop psychology. People clip stuff out of a magazine, and stuff like that, or it's not the let's get in here and actually study something. Like, I don't know if you were studying Freud, for instance, studying excerpts of things he wrote. That would be considered, oh, that's too difficult. But here's something that's kind of a cool, has all kinds of pictures and smiley faces and that sort of thing. Maybe the students will like that. And again, we set people up for failure if everything has to be this glitzy, kind of, attraction to it. In fact, I think we're kind of getting to this point where, you go out and big business is the only one that can afford to give you all that glitz and glamour and everything when you walk into the store. And so people feel like, oh, I'm here in my element, and it's all glittery and so forth. And maybe if you take them out in the woods and say, oh, here's a beautiful nature trail, they're like, oh, I need my phone, because they would find being in nature to be boring. Or if they're at the coast and it's beautiful, they're taking selfies of themselves against the ocean and they want to leave. I mean, Freud would have said, maybe he would have just said, enough is enough. You guys need to get back to what is real, what is basic, what humanity has evolved for. Again, I have heard that he started turning to more of a Jung's semi-occult ideas towards the end of his life. So he was making allowances for there being something bigger than just, you're here, you die, and that's it. But nevertheless, when he was writing his theories, it was kind of based on the idea of evolution. And his ideas would have been that humans have, they're like advanced animals. They have a bigger brain, but that they're still kind of, they have to give up a lot of their instincts to become part of this, modern society. And so therefore he would have said that, if you pull away too far from the basics, then you're going to wind up with a lot of disturbances in the brain, in the mind, and so forth, and that was going to cause problems. So, I remember, sometimes when you hear people say, well, things just aren't right nowadays, things need to change, and you get the idea that, oh, well, they must be from the political right or something. Not necessarily the case. Freud would not have considered himself right-wing. I don't think he'd have considered himself left-wing either. But ultimately, we, of course, affix labels. And, again, nowadays people would probably say Freud, if he was speaking at a college campus, was a right-wing extremist. Whereas maybe he was loved by the left back in the 1940s and 50s, more so than hated. But then there was this idea of, the left changed, and now he's not as popular with them, if at all. So, check up on his ideas. Try to find some stuff that's not like, colored with this idea of, oh, he was this, his theories suck and no one believes him anymore. Try to find some stuff that's of maybe even, a little older, and don't get caught up in this idea that things have to be current. That's one thing that I think we cheat our students in college nowadays with, is the idea that, if an important study, it has a date that's like, more than 2 years or 3 years old, then it must be wrong. There must be something more current that is better. And actually, many truths or insights or findings don't have a shelf life. I mean, the theory of gravity, do we have to say that, oh, well, there's not been any real good studies since Newton, so therefore we need to discount it? No, that's not the case. Just because something is older doesn't mean it's wrong, and it doesn't mean that necessarily things that have been added to it later are actually correct, because ultimately, and this may really, trigger a few people, ultimately, I think it's almost impossible to do any kind of study without some sort of cultural bias coming in. If you do a study in the 30s, that's going to have a certain cultural bias, and I will admit that. If you do something in the 60s, there's going to be a cultural bias. If you do something in the 90s, cultural bias. And if you do something in 2018, cultural bias. It will creep in no matter what. Unless you can develop some sort of AI that can completely check for all variables that are dependent upon culture, then you're not going to be able to have something that doesn't have a cultural component to it. So therefore, keep that in mind. So if something's written in 2018 about anything, probably there's some sort of bias in there that may as well say, 2018 cultural, schema for this particular finding. That's just the way it is. So anyway, just because Freud's old does not mean that some of his insights weren't correct. Doesn't mean they were all correct. It may mean that some of them might have been correct, but for the wrong reasons, and so forth. It doesn't matter. It's good to go back into the founding ideas that have so shaped Western society and then evaluate them. All right. So anyway, now the thing I want to deal with really quickly is the idea that, well, or maybe a question. Will the media, mainstream media of the United States, ever be able to regain its credibility? Now, I think what people have become very cognizant of, those who investigate and look around, and they can be on the left or the right, politically speaking, is that the media is an oligarchy. I mean, there's 5 or 6 major corporations or mega corporations that control pretty much all of the media within the United States. Now, I'm not talking about alternative media, but I am talking about big network stuff, and that is something that makes people wary about the motivations. And I only see more centralization taking place. It seems like the U.S. government, whether it's the media itself or social media, where you have just several large social media platforms that control pretty much, again, kind of like the whole market, so to speak. In the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt, you could go and try to go after these with antitrust legislation. And it would be interesting to see how that would turn out, because ultimately, if nothing is done, then the social media has the ability, through whether it's banning people or selectively censoring, or if it's just placing trending articles or whatever as a lower category, that's going to influence elections. In the same way that the traditional media, which is now an oligarchy as well, the traditional media would ignore candidates with views that they didn't particularly like, or they would demonize them, maybe not be as willing to put letters to the editor even from readers that were supporting a candidate or cause. And everyone understands how that, at least the citywide level, influenced elections. If you had a liberal newspaper, then the liberal candidates had a much better chance of winning. If you had a conservative newspaper, the conservative stood a better chance of winning. That's just the way it was, for decades. And now we have social media, which, isn't just in a city, but extends clear around the world. And so you can have a lot of influence if you control this particular message. Now, the thing is, we're starting to see a trend of people being not as apt to trust even social media now that they've seen some of the bias coming in. And, I'm thinking, what's going to happen in a free and democratic society in which we no longer can trust the information providers? And if this continues, yes, there will be those who just shut off and just don't want to participate anymore, but that leaves power to the vested interest. There will be those who may start turning to more radical causes. And this is kind of interesting. When the media, networks as well as the social media, think that maybe if they push out people who might, for instance, be the far right or the far left, they actually will cause them to grow, because suddenly people start wondering, well, what is their message? And I'm not inclined to think that all people are just blindly trusting what they see on TV or see on their computer screen. So if you ask me, can these entities regain trust that they've lost and are losing? My answer is no. I don't think they can. It's kind of like if you're being cheated on by your boyfriend or girlfriend. Hard to regain that trust. Easy. It takes a long time to build a reputation, and it takes a short time to destroy it. All right? And if you've got a situation in which, for instance, again, going back to, I'm going to spend more time on social media in a future show, but just dealing with the mainstream media, how can it change? I mean, if you get to a point where you feel like you can say and do anything and people just have to take it or leave it, then, and they're still getting their advertising revenue, then there's no need for them to change. In fact, they actually will get more arrogant in their viewpoints. And so ultimately, also, there's a tendency for maybe people who feel, I don't know, as an example, maybe conservatives feel like traditional journalism school would not be for them. And so then the pool of people that would be going into the media that would be either at the local level or national level is going to be made up of people who are of a different persuasion. And that would just mean it would get more and more to the left. And if this, continues and you have a disconnect between, again, the information provider and the target audience, this could lead to a snapping in which people want more alternative and they will just start, leaving media altogether. Now, of course, if they then feel like where they go to that alternative media, that's being stifled as well, who knows? Maybe there's going to be technological innovations or whatever that will take place in which maybe the social media people will be replaced as well. So the thing is that ultimately, yes, I do believe that social media had a lot to do with people no longer really trusting the mainstream media. And if the social media starts playing the game that the mainstream media is playing, then they're going to lose as well. I think social media could redeem itself. I think social media could actually make it a policy. They could try to make sure that viewpoints, whether they agree with them or not, whether they're on the left or the right, should remain free and open to the public, to where people that are doing political videos are not looking over their shoulder and wondering, is this going to cause me to get banned? Or is this going to cause me to get deprioritized? Or if those people that do get money off of these kinds of things, or is this going to cause them to lose money, or they won't be able to make money on these ventures? So again, I would actually hope that the social media people would understand their great influence and also their responsibility to maybe be fair and impartial and allowing people to be able to express themselves. And so far, they've been pretty good at it. Let's hope that would continue. And if that means what some people call the horse and buggy media of that we see on network programs, media, news, and so forth, just let them go by this, where the horse and buggy, is today, and that's in the museum. It's a time, I think we're going to enter an era where things are going to change, and a lot of the assumptions that we have will cease to, they won't be the reality of the future. Anyway, that's all the time we have now, and thank you for tuning in, and encourage you to check back later and watch, or listen to, I should say, another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.
Yeah. Check.